Inside a suffocating tent on the banks of the Volga, a young girl watches an old woman, known only as the Angel of Death, slowly heat a dagger over dying coals. Outside, warriors beat their shields rhythmically, not for glory, but to drown out the desperate screams that are about to begin. We are taught to revere the Vikings as fearless explorers. Yet, for the wives of their defeated enemies, they were merely the architects of a living hell. This is not a saga of conquest. It is the autopsy of a nightmare. Before we step into the darkness to witness what history tried to bury, make your presence known by subscribing to the channel, and whisper in the comments below, from which safe harbor are you watching tonight? The year is 922, and the wind howling across the banks of the Volga River carries the scent of wet ash and impending finality. Imagine, if you can bear it, that the ground beneath your feet is not the floor of your room, but the frozen mud of a Rus Viking encampment where the air itself seems thick with a palpable dread. You are standing in the shadow of a great ship that has been dragged onto the land, a vessel that was once built for the open sea, but is now destined to become a funeral pyre. Inside the heavy fabric of the chieftain's tent, a drama is unfolding that the Arab chronicler Ibn Fadlan would record with a trembling hand, a witnessing of events so alien to his sensibilities that his ink seemed to darken with the horror of it. Focus your gaze on the girl. She is young. Perhaps 19 winters have passed since she was torn from her Slavic village, and for the last 10 days, she's been walking through a haze of intoxicating herbs and fermented honey, a chemical veil designed to detach her spirit from the terrifying reality of her flesh. She has volunteered, or so the ritual demands we believe, to accompany her master into the afterlife. But look closer at her eyes, glazed and distant, and you will see that this is not a choice made in freedom, but a surrender to an inevitability that was written the moment the chains were first placed upon her wrists. She is no longer a person, she is a grave good, a breathing artifact to be consumed by the flames alongside the horses, the weapons, and the gold. The figure dominating this scene is not a warrior, but an old woman of imposing stature and grim countenance, known to the tribe as the Angel of Death. It is she who orchestrates the transition, she who mixes the draughts that numb the mind, and she who holds the dagger that waits in the corner, its blade reflecting the dim firelight like a cold promise. Ibn Fadlan writes that this woman was responsible for the sewing up of the corpse and the killing of the girl, a dual role of seamstress and executioner that underscores the chilling practicality of Norse ritual. To her, the girl is merely a loose thread in the tapestry of the chieftain's departure, a thread that must be cut to complete the pattern. As the sun begins to dip below the horizon, casting long skeletal shadows across the camp, the preliminary rites conclude, and the true horror of the evening commences. The girl is led to the doorframe of a structure that symbolizes the gate to the other side. She is lifted up 3 times. The first time, she whispers that she sees her father and mother. The second, she sees all her deceased relatives. The third, she proclaims that she sees her master seated in paradise, a paradise that, in the twisted logic of this ceremony, requires her absolute destruction to enter. These words are not her own, but a script rehearsed under the influence of potent narcotics, a performance for the living to validate the delusions of the dead. Then comes the silence before the storm. The girl is led not to the ship immediately, but back into the tent where 6 warriors await. In the sanitized versions of history, we might call this a ritual union, but let us strip away the euphemisms and see it for the biological tax it truly was. Ibn Fadlan records that each man entered the tent to pay his respects to the dead chieftain by using the living vessel one last time. It was a systematic claiming, a brutal assertion of ownership that reduced the girl to a conduit for their masculine vitality, ensuring that she carried the essence of the tribe with her into the fire. Outside, the men began to beat their wooden staves against their shields, a rhythmic, hollow thunder designed specifically to drown out any screams that might escape the heavy canvas. For the screams of the sacrifice were thought to displease the gods, and in this architecture of suffering, even her final cry of agony was forbidden. When the moment of expiration arrived, it was not quick. The angel of death looped a knotted rope around the girl's neck, handing the ends to two men who began to pull in opposite directions, a slow strangulation that choked off the breath of life while the old woman drove her broad-bladed dagger between the ribs, searching for the heart with the precision of a butcher. The world did not end with a bang, but with the fading of light in a smoke-filled tent, followed by the roar of flames that would consume both the victim and the oppressor, leaving nothing but indistinguishable ash to be scattered by the indifferent wind. This was the fate of Sigrid. This was the fate of thousands whose names were never recorded by curious travellers, women who were burned, strangled, and broken to serve as eternal accessories to male vanity. But to understand how a human being becomes a piece of disposable inventory, we must rewind the clock and travel west, across the grey, turbulent waters, to the holy island of Lindisfarne. The date is June the 8th, in the year of our Lord 793, a day that would sever the timeline of Europe into before and after. Sister Ethelred, a woman whose life had been measured in the rhythmic tolling of bells and the scratching of quills on vellum, found herself crouching in the suffocating darkness of a grain store, her lungs burning with dust and terror. Outside, the air was not filled with the chanting of monks, but with the guttural roars of men who spoke a language that sounded like stones grinding together. Through the cracks in the wooden walls, she witnessed the dismantling of her world. The Vikings did not just loot gold and silver. They came to harvest the most valuable resource of all. She watched as her sisters in faith were dragged by their hair across the courtyard, their habits torn, their prayers silenced by the back of a heavy hand. It was here, on this blood-soaked beach, that the great sorting began. A process so cold and agricultural in its efficiency that it strips the soul bare just to contemplate it. The raiders moved among the weeping women with the practiced eye of farmers inspecting livestock at a market. They were not looking for piety or intellect. They were assessing biological utility. The elderly, the infirm, and those whose spirits were too visibly broken were discarded immediately, their lives extinguished with a casual swing of an axe, left to rot where they fell because they would not survive the journey, and dead cargo yields no profit. The young, the strong, and the beautiful were separated into a different cluster, their value calculated in silver weight before they had even left the shore. Sister Ethelred felt a rough hand plunge into her hiding place, fingers closing around her arm with the strength of iron bands. She was hauled into the blinding sunlight, blinking against the sudden brightness that revealed the carnage in high definition. The warrior who held her smelled of old sweat, salt water, and dried blood, a sensory assault that she would associate with fear for the rest of her short life. He did not look at her face. He looked at her hands, checking for strength. He looked at her hips, assessing breeding potential. He looked at her teeth, estimating age. In that singular, terrifying moment, Ethelred ceased to be a bride of Christ, a scholar, or a daughter of Northumbria. She became an asset, a unit of production, a thing. She was shoved toward the waiting longships, forced to step over the bodies of the men who had tried to defend the monastery, their sacrifice rendered meaningless by the utter dominance of the invaders. As she was thrown into the hold of the ship, landing on the tangled limbs of other captives, the realization settled upon her like a heavy stone. This was not merely captivity. This was an erasure. The damp wood of the hull pressed against her cheek, vibrating with the impact of the waves, and she understood that with every stroke of the oars, she was being rowed further from her humanity, toward a horizon where God seemed to have turned his back, leaving her to the mercy of men who recognized no sin. If the journey across the North Sea was a purgatory of seasickness and terror, arrival at the great slave markets of Dublin or Hedeby was the descent into the ninth circle. By the mid-9th century, Dublin had transformed from a modest settlement into the Western world's most efficient hub for human trafficking, a place where the air permanently smelled of unwashed bodies, livestock manure, and the metallic tang of counting house silver. Imagine standing there, your legs still trembling from weeks at sea, blinded by the grey Irish light, surrounded by a cacophony of languages, Norse, Gaelic, Frankish, Arabic, all haggling over the price of flesh. You are no longer a person with a history. You are a commodity with a fluctuating market value, an asset to be liquidated for weapons, silk, or spice. The humiliation of the auction block was designed with cold mercantile precision. The Vikings, often romanticized as passionate warriors, were in reality pragmatic businessmen who approached the sale of women with the same detached scrutiny one might apply to the purchase of timber or cattle. The inspection process was a systematic violation of personal boundaries. Fingers, calloused and indifferent, would pry open jaws to inspect teeth, not to check for a smile, but to estimate age and health. For a slave who dies too soon is a bad investment. Hands would run down spines and across hips, checking for the width that suggested easy childbearing or the sturdiness required for decades of grinding grain. It was a tactile invasion where every touch stripped away another layer of dignity, leaving the victim naked in spirit long before they were stripped in body. In this sprawling marketplace of misery, women were sorted into 3 distinct categories, each with its own grim trajectory. The first group, often the older women or those with hands already roughened by labour, were designated as work cattle. Their fate was to be sold to the harsh farms of Iceland or the rocky outposts of the Orkneys, where they would spend 18 hours a day turning the heavy quern stones to grind flour, a repetitive, bone-destroying motion that would twist their joints and break their backs before they reached the age of 40. They were machines of calories, fed just enough to keep the engine running, discarded the moment the gears seized. The second category was the breeders. These were the young, the healthy, the women whose wide hips promised a steady supply of future slaves. In the twisted economics of the Viking Age, a female slave's value lay not just in her labour, but in her womb. Any child she bore would automatically inherit her status as property, a self-replicating asset for the master's estate. To be placed in this group was to face a lifetime of biological warfare, where pregnancy was not a joy but a production quota, and where the children you nursed were not yours to love, but your master's to sell. The third category, and perhaps the most haunting, were those marked for special purposes. These were the high-born, the exceptionally beautiful, the daughters of Frankish counts or Irish kings. They were not destined for the mud of the farmyard, but for the silk-draped cages of the East. They would be groomed, fed, and transported down the Russian river systems to the wealthy markets of Constantinople or Baghdad, where pale skin and red hair commanded premiums that could outfit an entire warship. For them, the horror was gilded. A life of soft cushions and silent rooms where they would exist solely as ornamental playthings, their voices silenced by the weight of the gold paid for their purchase. But if the market was where the body was sold, The law was where the soul was erased. To understand the true depth of this nightmare, we must look to the Gragas, the grey goose laws of the Icelandic Commonwealth. It is here, written in the dry bureaucratic language of legal statutes, that we find the absolute negation of female humanity. In the eyes of Viking law, a female thrall had no more rights than a sheep or a table. She could own nothing, inherit nothing, and leave nothing behind. If she was injured, the compensation, known as vergild, was paid not to her but to her master for damage to his property. If she was killed, the murderer paid the replacement cost of a comparable slave, a transaction no different from settling a debt for a broken plough. The most chilling manifestation of this legal dehumanization was a custom known as the morning gift. The term sounds almost poetic, evoking images of sunlight and generosity, but the reality was a grotesque parody of hospitality. It was customary for a chieftain or a wealthy farmer to offer his female slaves to honored guests for the duration of their stay. This was not considered an act of violence in the legal sense. It was a courtesy, a lending of domestic amenities. The woman had no legal standing to refuse. Her body was the master's to lend, just as his cup was his to fill. Imagine the psychological abyss of living in a household where you are not only a servant by day, but a gift by night, passed between strangers whose languages you might not even speak, your trauma framed as their entertainment. This system created a generation of children born into a void of identity. The Gragas was explicit. The status of the child follows the mother. It did not matter if the father was a king, a jarl, or a free farmer. If the mother was a thrall, the child was a thrall. This law ensured that slavery was hereditary, a stain in the blood that could not be washed away. We must consider the psychological weight carried by these mothers, looking into the eyes of their newborns and knowing that the very first breath the infant took was drawn in chains. They were raising their own replacements, nurturing the next generation of labor and pleasure for the very men who held them captive. This was not a chaotic evil, but an organized one. The mourning gift, the inheritance laws, the compensation tables, they were all parts of a sophisticated legal framework designed to normalize the unthinkable. It allowed Viking society to function with a clear conscience. For how can one sin against a tool? How can one commit a crime against an object? By stripping these women of their legal personhood, the Vikings inoculated themselves against guilt, building a civilization that celebrated freedom and democracy for the few, while resting heavily on the silent, breaking backs of the many. While the markets dealt in labor and the laws dealt in property, the high halls of the Viking chieftains were the stage for a more insidious form of conquest. Biological warfare disguised as marriage. We often think of the Viking Age in terms of land grabbed and monasteries burned, but the most enduring territory they seized was the womb. For the daughters of the defeated nobility, women like the fictionalized yet historically representative Brianna of Ireland or Orlaith of Scotland, the nightmare did not end with chains. It began with a wedding ring. These were not unions of love, nor even of political alliance in the traditional sense. They were absorptions. A Viking warlord, having slaughtered a local king and his sons, would often take the surviving daughter as his wife. This was a stroke of cold political genius. By marrying her, he legitimized his claim to the conquered lands through her bloodline, pacifying the local population who saw their own princess in the hall, even if she sat there as a hostage in her own home. But for the woman, the psychological torture was absolute. She was forced to share a bed with the man whose hands were stained with the blood of her father and brothers. She was expected to pour his mead, laugh at his feasts, and most devastatingly, bear his children. Consider the cruelty of this genetic conquest. These women became the vessels through which their own culture was erased. They gave birth to sons who had their mother's eyes, but their father's sword hand. They raised children who were taught to speak Norse, to worship Odin and Thor, and to despise the very people their mothers came from. It was a slow-motion genocide of identity, where a woman had to watch her own flesh and blood grow up to become the next generation of her oppressors. This was not just survival. It was a daily betrayal of her ancestors, forced upon her by the biological imperativeness of protecting her offspring, regardless of their origin. Modern science has finally given voice to this silence. Genetic studies of the Icelandic population have revealed a staggering truth that the sagas tried to hide. While the male lineage of the founding settlers is overwhelmingly Norse, nearly 2/3 of the female lineage is Celtic, primarily from Ireland and Scotland. This statistical disparity is the smoking gun of history. It tells us that the colonization of the North Atlantic was not a migration of families, but a migration of male warriors and the women they stole. Every strand of DNA in the modern Icelandic population that traces back to the British Isles is a microscopic monument to a kidnapped woman, a biological echo of a scream that rang out over 1,000 years ago. But to assume these women were merely passive victims is to underestimate the resilience of the human spirit. In the shadows of the longhouses, in the quiet corners of the brewing rooms, a secret war was being waged. If they could not defeat the Vikings with axes, they would fight them with what they had: silence, secrets, and the deadly knowledge of the natural world. Resistance was rarely a dramatic uprising. It was intimate, domestic, and often fatal. The saga of the slave woman Deirdre offers a glimpse into this hidden rebellion. Entrusted with the brewing of ale and the preparation of food, roles that made her invisible yet indispensable, she possessed the power of life and death in her calloused hands. The forests of Scandinavia are rich with mushrooms and herbs that, to the untrained eye, look benign, but to a woman who knows the old ways, are slow-acting poisons. A pinch of crushed nightshade here, a drop of hemlock there, not enough to kill instantly, which would arouse suspicion, but enough to bring a slow, wasting sickness upon a cruel master. It was a vengeance measured in months, a quiet satisfaction in watching the oppressor wither, his strength failing him just as he had failed his humanity. Yet, the most heartbreaking form of resistance was not murder, but a twisted form of mercy. Archaeological evidence and fragmented folklore whisper of a practice that is almost too painful to articulate: infanticide. Mothers, driven by a love so fierce it looked like madness, would sometimes choose to snuff out the lives of their newborns rather than condemn them to a lifetime of slavery. In the cold light of dawn, a baby might be found accidentally smothered or left too long in the winter draft. We must not judge these acts by the standards of our comfort, but view them through the lens of their despair. For a mother to kill her own child is an act against nature. For her to believe that death is a safer cradle than her master's house is an indictment of the society that drove her to it. It was the ultimate refusal of the property rights claimed by the Vikings, a declaration that, "You may own my body, but you will not own my future." There were also subtler rebellions. The preservation of language and song became an act of defiance. When the men were away raiding, mothers would whisper stories of their homelands to their children in their native tongues, planting seeds of a dual identity that the Viking fathers could never fully weed out. They wove symbols of their Christian faith into the patterns of Norse tapestries, hidden in plain sight. They maintained a clandestine network of communication, a grapevine of slaves stretching across farms and fjords, sharing news, warnings, and small comforts. In a world designed to strip them of everything, holding onto a single word of Gaelic, a single memory of home, was a victory. We return now, for the final time, to the banks of the Volga. The sun has vanished, and the only light comes from the torches that flicker like nervous eyes in the dark. The climax of the ritual is at hand. Sigrid, the girl whose name we have plucked from the void of history, stands once more within the tent on the deck of the ship. The 6 warriors have departed, their grim duty concluded. She is alone now, with the angel of death and the 2 men who hold the ends of the twisted cord. The noise outside has reached a crescendo, a chaotic symphony of shield banging and chanting designed to mask the reality of what happens next. But inside the tent, the world narrows down to a terrifying intimacy. There is no glory here. There is no Valkyrie descending on wings of light. There is only the rough texture of the rope against soft skin and the cold, unimpassioned gaze of the old woman who has done this 100 times before. Ibn Fadlan's account is unsparing in its mechanical detail. He describes the moment not as a spiritual ascension, but as a physical extinguishing. The men pull the cord. The breath is stolen from the girl's lungs, panic flaring in her eyes as the narcotic haze finally breaks against the sharp edge of mortality. And then the angel of death steps forward. She does not hesitate. The broad blade in her hand is driven between the ribs, seeking the silence of the heart. It happens in the space of a few heartbeats, the struggle, the impact, and then the stillness. The girl, who was once a daughter, a captive, a servant, is now merely an object, arranged beside the decaying corpse of her master. She has been neutralized, her life force spent to purchase his passage into legend. The torch is applied to the wood. The fire, hungry and indifferent, begins to climb the hull of the ship. It consumes the silk tapestries, the slaughtered horses, the gold arm rings, and the bodies of the dead. As the flames roar into the night sky, casting a column of smoke that drifts toward the heavens, the Vikings on the shore cheer. They see a chieftain ascending to Valhalla. But we, looking back through the lens of centuries, see something else. We see the smoke of a human sacrifice. We see the final, total erasure of a woman whose only crime was to be born in the path of a longship. History is often written by the victors, carved into rune stones and recorded in sagas that sing of courage, exploration, and conquest. We build museums to their ships. We make movies about their kings. We marvel at the intricacy of their jewelry and the reach of their trade networks. But we must never forget the foundation upon which this golden age was built. It was a civilization underpinned by an infrastructure of suffering, a machinery of enslavement that processed human beings as fuel for its expansion. The legacy of the Vikings is not just in the artifacts they left behind, but in the blood that flows through the veins of the living. The DNA of the North Atlantic is a living archive, a biological record of the women who were taken, the women who survived, and the women who were forced to mother a new world. We are the descendants of the conquerors, yes, but we are also the children of the captives. So, the next time you look at a map of the Viking world, do not just see the trade routes and the battlefields. Look at the empty spaces between the lines. Listen to the silence between the words of the sagas. For in that silence, if you listen closely enough, you can still hear them. The whisper of the weaver at her loom, the weeping of the mother in the hold, and the final, unrecorded breath of the girl in the burning ship. They are gone, but let us ensure that they are no longer forgotten. The fire on the Volga has long since burned out. The ash has been scattered by 1,000 years of wind, but the question remains, hanging in the dark like the smoke of that funeral pyre.